March 21st, 2002. A calm morning settled over the seaside town of Seaton, Carew. The waves rolled gently against the shore as a man carried his canoe toward the water. His name was John Darwin. To neighbors, he seemed like any other middle-aged man taking advantage of the crisp spring air for a paddle. But what happened that morning would shock the nation. Hours later, John Darwin was nowhere to be found. His canoe was discovered smashed and abandoned. Within days, authorities presumed the worst. The sea had claimed him. His family mourned, the community grieved, and official records marked him as dead. Yet behind this apparent tragedy lay a story unlike anything people imagined. Because John Darwin was not dead, he was alive, plotting, and watching the world believe his disappearance. What drives a man to fake his own death? How long can such a dangerous lie last before the truth tears it all apart? John Darwin's story begins in the modest town of Hartlepool in northeast England. Born in 1950, he grew up in a working-class family where ambition meant hard work and persistence. By most accounts, Darwin followed a straightforward path. After school, he pursued a career in education, first training as a teacher. Later, he switched professions and became a prison officer, a job that offered security but little glamour. Those who knew him described him as practical, quietly determined, and sometimes restless, always searching for something more than an ordinary life. In the 1970s, John married Anne Stevenson. Together, they seemed to represent a picture of stability. They built a life in the quiet suburbs, raising 2 sons, and for years the family appeared like any other, solid, dependable, even unremarkable. But beneath that surface, Darwin was nursing bigger ambitions. He and Anne were not content to rely on steady wages alone. Like many middle-class couples of the time, they looked to property as a way to build wealth and secure their future. By the late 1990s, their real estate ventures had grown far beyond a safe bet. The Darwins invested heavily in multiple homes, taking on large loans to expand their portfolio. At first, it looked promising. Property values were rising, and the couple believed they had found the key to financial freedom. But as debts mounted, the risks began to outweigh the rewards. Interest payments ballooned, tenants became unreliable, and the once bright dream of financial independence started to feel more like a trap. Anne reportedly grew uneasy as the bills piled up, but John remained convinced that fortune was just around the corner. Yet with every passing month, the pressure deepened. Bankruptcy loomed on the horizon, and the family's carefully built life was at risk of collapsing. For a man who had built his identity on control and stability, the thought of losing everything was unbearable. It was in this atmosphere of desperation that a dark idea began to take root. John Darwin believed he had discovered a way out, a plan so bold, so unthinkable, that it could solve his money problems once and for all. But that plan would require him to vanish, to stage his own death, and to leave his family and community believing he had been lost forever. The morning of March 21st, 2002, seemed ordinary on the northeastern coast of England. John Darwin, a former teacher turned prison officer, carried his canoe to the water and paddled into the calm sea. It was the last time anyone would see him alive. At least, that was the story. By late afternoon, alarm bells began to ring. When John failed to return home, his wife Anne reported him missing. Soon, the police and Coast Guard were alerted, sparking an urgent search operation. The North Sea can be treacherous, but on this particular day, the conditions were unusually calm. That fact immediately struck rescuers as odd. Canoe accidents were not uncommon, yet they usually happened during storms or rough waters. Here, the sea was flat and quiet, leaving little explanation for why a skilled canoeist like John would suddenly vanish. As daylight faded, the search intensified. Helicopters hovered above the coastline, lifeboats combed the waters, and volunteers scanned the shore for any sign of him. Every passing hour added weight to the growing fear that John had drowned. By the following day, search teams made a discovery: the wreckage of John's canoe, washed up near Seaton, Carew. To many, it seemed to confirm the worst. News of the disappearance spread quickly, and the local community was gripped by shock. Friends and neighbors rallied around Anne, offering sympathy and support. She was suddenly a widow, left to face life without her husband of nearly 30 years. Their two sons, Mark and Anthony, were devastated. To them, their father was not only missing, but most likely gone forever. For days, headlines spoke of the tragic accident. The image of a devoted husband and father lost at sea stirred genuine sorrow. Yet beneath the surface, something about the case didn't sit right. Some rescuers quietly admitted their confusion. The sea had been calm. The canoe was found, but John's body was not. Was it possible he had somehow survived? Could a man simply disappear into thin air while out on familiar waters? As time passed, grief began to mix with speculation. Authorities eventually declared John presumed dead, and life moved forward for his family. Sympathy cards arrived, neighbors checked in, and the community mourned alongside Anne and her sons. To the outside world, it looked like a cruel accident that had robbed a family of its anchor. But while sorrow filled the Darwin household, practical matters soon entered the picture. John's disappearance opened the door to an insurance claim. With no body recovered, the process was complex. But the missing at sea scenario gave the family grounds to pursue financial compensation. At the time, few gave this much thought. After all, what grieving widow wouldn't seek stability after such a loss? In reality, this was the beginning of something far darker. The canoe wreckage, the community's sympathy, even the insurance papers, they were all part of a much larger story, one that would unravel in ways no one could have predicted. John Darwin had not vanished at sea. Instead, he had set into motion one of the most audacious frauds in modern British history. For the outside world, John Darwin was dead. A man lost at sea, mourned by his family, honored with a death certificate. But the truth was far stranger. While neighbors expressed sympathy, Darwin was alive, hiding in plain sight. Only a few steps away from the home he once shared with his wife, he was secretly living in the house next door, slipping between shadows, depending on Anne's loyalty to keep his existence hidden. Anne, playing the role of a grieving widow, wasted no time in claiming his life insurance. With the certificate of death in hand, she received thousands of pounds meant to ease the pain of loss. Instead, that money became the foundation of their double life. To the world, she was brokenhearted. Behind closed doors, she and her supposedly dead husband began planning their future. But secrecy always has cracks. From time to time, Darwin was spotted by tenants and locals. Some described brief, confusing encounters where a man who looked very much like John appeared in the neighborhood. These sightings were often brushed aside as imagination or coincidence. After all, how could a dead man be walking around? Yet, these quiet whispers would later play a critical role in exposing the fraud. The Darwins' ambitions stretched beyond England. They wanted to leave their old life behind completely, to build a new one under foreign skies. Cyprus was considered first, but the allure of Panama eventually became irresistible. It was a country far enough to hide, yet open enough to allow reinvention. In their minds, Panama represented freedom. They dreamed of buying land, creating a grand estate, and starting over without the weight of their lies pressing so heavily. To make this fantasy possible, Darwin adopted new identities. He became John Jones, then John Williams, reinventing himself again and again. With forged documents and carefully rehearsed backstories, he slipped into these roles like an actor playing a part. Each new identity was a shield, protecting him from the truth of who he really was, a fugitive hiding in the shell of a respectable man. The Panama Dream Estate became a symbol of their deception. They walked through lush plots of land, spoke of investments, and made plans for a glittering new life. But behind every conversation was the constant fear of exposure. They carried secrets too heavy to bury forever. And even in paradise, suspicion has a way of catching up. Anne's behavior began to attract quiet suspicion. While she appeared to move on as a widow, she made choices that didn't quite fit the role. Her financial dealings, her confidence in moving forward, and her eagerness to relocate abroad Raised eyebrows. What widow rushes to buy property in Panama only a few years after tragedy? What grieving wife seems so prepared for her new chapter? The missing years were not a peaceful escape, but a dangerous balancing act. Every lie carried the risk of collapse. Every new identity invited a question. Every strange sighting chipped away at the illusion. For 5 long years, John Darwin was alive but living like a ghost, trying to escape the world's gaze while building a fragile dream that was destined to unravel. By 2007, the fantasy that John Darwin and his wife had built began to close in on them. For years, they had hidden behind the tropical calm of Panama, convinced that distance and new identities would keep their secret safe. But a shift in Panama's visa laws suddenly forced them into a corner. If they wanted to stay in the country legally, they needed official documents that would reveal the very lie they had worked so hard to maintain. The cracks in their story were no longer subtle. They were widening fast. Faced with no other choice, Darwin returned to the United Kingdom in December 2007. He walked into a police station in London, claiming he had been suffering from amnesia. Imagine the audacity. 5 years gone, declared dead, and now he stood before officers insisting he had no memory of what had happened. It was a performance meant to erase suspicion, but instead, it lit the first spark of doubt in the minds of investigators. How could a man vanish at sea, be legally declared dead, and then stroll back as if nothing had happened? When the news reached his wife, Anne, she played her role flawlessly, or so she thought. She expressed shock, tears, even relief, presenting herself as a woman who had just been given back her long-lost husband. But the performance was already beginning to unravel. The media, quick to sense a story too bizarre to be true, started digging. Within days, a photograph surfaced online. It showed John and Anne Darwin together in Panama, smiling for the camera as if they had nothing to hide. That single image, discovered with a simple Google search, tore their elaborate scheme apart. The police wasted no time. Both John and Anne were arrested, charged with fraud and deception. The evidence was overwhelming. False insurance claims, property deals, forged stories, and now undeniable proof that John had been alive all along. What had once seemed like a flawless scheme was now an open and shut case. But the greatest damage was not financial or legal. It was personal. Their 2 sons, who had genuinely believed their father was dead, were shattered by the revelation. To them, it wasn't just fraud. It was betrayal of the deepest kind. Imagine learning that the grief you carried for years, the pain you endured, had been orchestrated by your own parents. The heartbreak of Mark and Anthony Darwin became a central part of the public's outrage. Their parents had not only tricked insurance companies and the law, they had deceived their own family. For the public, the case became more than a crime story. It was a spectacle of lies, greed, and cruelty, laid bare in the most humiliating way. The Darwins had thought they were clever enough to fool everyone, but in the end, their undoing came from something as ordinary as a photograph on the internet. The courtroom was packed with reporters, officials, and members of the public who had followed every twist in this bizarre saga. By the time John Darwin appeared before the judge, the story of the man who had faked his own death had become headline news around the world. But beneath the sensational headlines was a mountain of hard evidence that made escape impossible. Investigators laid out the trail of deception. Pension payments had continued long after John was declared dead. Bank accounts showed transfers linking both John and Anne to money hidden away. Passports proved he had traveled freely under his own name. The evidence was not only damning, it was overwhelming. Faced with the reality of the case, John Darwin made the choice to plead guilty. He admitted to the fraud and to deceiving not only the state, but also his own sons. It was a confession that carried a heavy weight, but it also spared him the humiliation of a long trial. Anne Darwin, however, took a very different path. She denied everything, insisting that she had simply followed her husband's lead, a victim of his manipulation. But prosecutors were ready for her defense. They argued she had been far more than a passive partner. They pointed to her role in handling finances, maintaining the lies, and even writing letters that kept the falsehood alive. The trial exposed not just a crime, but a betrayal of trust at the deepest level. For the prosecution, Anne's lies cut sharper than John's. She had stood before her sons, family, and friends, presenting grief while secretly plotting with her husband. One prosecutor went so far as to say her actions were cold, deliberate, and cruel because they exploited the sympathy of those closest to her. In July 2008, justice finally came. John Darwin was sentenced to 6 years and 3 months in prison. Anne Darwin received a longer term, 6 years and 6 months. The court made it clear that both had acted out of greed, showing little thought for the people they hurt most. For the Darwins, the sentencing was the end of a scheme built on lies. For their sons, it was a moment of devastating clarity. Their parents had not only committed fraud, they had done so at the cost of love, honesty, and family trust. The years that followed John Darwin's dramatic exposure were far from glamorous. After being convicted of fraud, he was handed a prison sentence, though the time he ultimately served was shorter than many expected. Released in 2011, just over half of his 6-year term completed, his return to ordinary life was anything but ordinary. For a man who had once engineered a scheme so elaborate it fooled banks, insurers, and even his own family, prison became a humbling reminder of how quickly lies unravel. But freedom did not mean freedom from consequences. John was ordered to repay the stolen funds, yet the reality was sobering. From the nearly $700,000 pocketed through his deception, only a fraction was ever returned. His financial troubles mounted, and with no meaningful assets left, the illusion of wealth he had once created crumbled into long-term struggle. The strain extended beyond money. In 2012, Anne Darwin divorced John, ending a marriage that had endured decades, though scarred by betrayal. Their relationship had been at the center of the fraud, but once the prison gates opened, it could not withstand the weight of mistrust and humiliation. Meanwhile, the story of the so-called Canoe Man gripped the nation long after the court case closed. The scandal was not just remembered but immortalized. In 2010, the BBC aired Canoe Man, a dramatization of John's deceit. A decade later, ITV revived public fascination with The Thief, His Wife, and the Canoe, bringing renewed attention to one of Britain's boldest frauds. Even today, John Darwin's name carries a peculiar legacy. His tale has become shorthand for audacious deception, a case that blurred the line between desperation and reckless ambition. Few frauds have captured the imagination of the public quite like his, and his story continues to echo as both a cautionary tale and a reminder of how far someone will go to escape the life they built. In the end, the question remains, was it worth it? For John Darwin, the answer is painfully clear. His elaborate scheme gave him nothing more than a fleeting escape. He may have fooled the world for a few years, but the price he paid was far greater than any financial gain. He destroyed the trust of his sons, shattered his family, and turned his name into a symbol of deceit. Reputation, dignity, and freedom, all lost to a lie. It is tempting to look at his story as clever or daring, but beneath the surface lies only greed and selfishness. The truth always finds its way to shore, no matter how deep someone tries to bury it. The sea didn't take John Darwin's life that day. Greed did.